It's an exciting week here at RotoViz. It is the 2024 Rookie Guide on the horizon right here. Maybe even by the time listening to this, maybe possible to have a copy for yourself to look through. We're going to give a preview today to talk through some of the prospects in the guide. We're going to talk about what Shawn, Blair, Curtis, and Dave have done to put the guide together. I'm excited for this one, Shawn. I dropped a quick kind of 10-minute conversation with myself basically on Monday to talk through what people wanted over the course of the offseason from RotoViz Overtime. But I did talk on that about, there is no offseason. We are into the draft season. We're into prospect season, the combine. And I think once the guide is here, we are really on that path. And I know you and the guys that I mentioned a moment ago have been working very, very hard behind the scenes, including the summit, which you have your discussions to make sure everything is going to be perfect for the guide itself. So much to talk through, but before we get into the guide itself, going to hype the guide up a little bit. 98 player profiles in the guide, rankings and tiers in the guide. There's mock drafts in the guide, and people always want sleepers, Shawn. There's sleepers conversations in the guide. So volume 1 drops this week. That is basically your pre-combine volume off the guide. There's 3 volumes in total. Then you get the post-combine. Then you get the NFL draft. $19.99 gets you access to all of those. There will be a link in today's show notes to be able to go over there and make your purchase if you wish to do so. I would highly recommend it. But Shawn, the listeners will not let me off the hook without asking you one question. We did not do a show post-Super Bowl. I was on vacation at that time. The Chiefs win the Super Bowl in dramatic circumstances with possibly the most clutch quarterback of all time, a guy who does not really... He's lost in the postseason, but he doesn't lose very often in the postseason. Patrick Mahomes getting another ring, him and Andy Reid, along with Travis Kelce, solidifying their credentials towards the Hall of Fame. How was the Super Bowl for you, Shawn? I'm sure the end of it was truly joyous, but I asked you this before we started recording. I'm sure there was a little bit of stress during that game as they were behind for quite a portion of it.
Yeah, you try and handle your stress and anxiety in a variety of different ways. And one of them, and this, may be anathema to an extent for, sports fans, but just to try and keep in mind, how much good fortune you've already had. And it's this kind of contrast between wanting your guys and your team to build a dynasty and to get credit for the greatness. And in order to get credit for it, you've got to achieve it, right? So you want to achieve that and continue to move forward. At the same time, you don't want to join sort of these evil empires. You certainly don't want to be mentioned with like the Los Angeles Dodgers and what they're doing to Major League Baseball. You want to be the good guys. And so part of it is that if other teams win, then other players and other fans get to experience what you've experienced. And sometimes remembering that can help with those nerves when you're going down the stretch or you're at the beginning of the game. And, as Romo continued to say, the Chiefs were struggling in the trenches for a while. And not only were they able to turn that around, but they were able to win the game in the battle of tactics down the stretch. And that's in no way, I don't think, a criticism of or an emperor has no clothes moment for Kyle Shanahan. I mean, he's one of the greatest coaches out there. One of the things that I do think has been interesting about this, and obviously you come in with just huge bias as a fan, but I mean, the Chiefs have beaten really good teams in the AFC Championship games and in the Super Bowl. And you think back to, these 4 recent Super Bowls, and it was really the one kind of mediocre team they faced in the Super Bowl that they lost to, and not only lost, but got hammered by. Obviously, they were dealing with some injuries. Obviously, the Buccaneers played a fantastic game. You have to give them credit for that. These 2 49ers teams and the Eagles team that the Chiefs defeated, I mean, if those teams win the Super Bowl, then I think you can look at them as sort of all-time great teams. So from that perspective, as a Chiefs fan, you're pretty grateful. Also, those things that you're saying about Patrick Mahomes, the things that you're saying and everybody's saying about Andy Reid, I mean, they're very deserving of those. And, for me too, always think about hubris and humility and trying to, have an opinion that's an informed opinion that would, I mean, we're not running these teams, so it doesn't really matter what our opinions are, but it was frustrating when the Chiefs moved Tyreek Hill and then they come back and they add some defensive pieces. There was some risk there. Obviously, the offense has struggled at times, although from an efficiency perspective, it probably is overstated a little bit. One of the things that happens in some of these games is there are very few possessions. One of the reasons that the Chiefs were able to score some points in the Super Bowl is that there were a lot of possessions, right? And so, if you remove some of the possessions, then that game is like 10-10. But you look at this and you look at how they hit on those defensive players and what that means in terms of building their overall team. You've got to give the GM, you've got to give the owner, you've got to give all of those guys an immense amount of credit for this team that they've built. Because even though it was a frustrating and boring and in many cases disappointing team during the course of the season, by the time they'd reached the Super Bowl, this was the best Patrick Mahomes team that they've had. And obviously teams like this face a lot of questions in terms of retaining personnel. If you're going to try and add personnel, the Chiefs desperately need to add some playmaking on offense. And there are reasons why that will be difficult, just from a structural perspective, with all of the salary things you have to deal with as you go and win Super Bowls. And yet, what they have done not only allows them to have won back-to-back Super Bowls now, but they're pretty well positioned for the next decade to be in this situation where the Chiefs have been able to accomplish these things and are still positioned better for the future than the vast majority of teams out there, including the good teams, right? But there's still the possibility of more in the future. That gets you excited. At the same time, there is that part of you that just wants everybody to get to experience it and doesn't want it to be something where the Chiefs become the Patriots. You don't want to be the hated team, and the Patriots deserve to be the hated team at some point.
They might be getting there, Shawn. They might be getting there. That third one might be the one where it all changes. You will see that, I'm sure, over the course. So we did see it at times so far, but when a team has success, I think it brings more negativity, I think, sometimes with the positivity that they experience from other fan bases, obviously. But that is going to be pretty much a perfect way to sum it up to move into the draft. You mentioned that they hit on those defensive players. Well, obviously, we'll be talking on the offensive side throughout the rookie guide here, but one of the things I will give you huge props for, Shawn, in the moment as a Kansas City Chiefs fan, when they traded away Tyreek Hill, you embedded a kind of live reaction to that. And you mentioned that this may make the Kansas City Chiefs better. And they have now won 2 Super Bowls in 3 seasons without Tyreek Hill, which, the distance traveled in terms of air yards and Patrick Mahomes' touchdowns has regressed dramatically in that time. But that's not going to matter as they're getting the results on the field. So that was one in the moment. I think, you mentioned that it could be good for them, and what the front office there have actually achieved with those picks is what has actually been able to make that adjustment. And, it's a bit like a dynasty team when you're moving on those players, and you're like, that is basically the perfect version of trying to perpetually reload. And they did it with moving it onto the defensive side of the ball. But we'll see what they do moving forward. Shawn, the guide itself, though, let's get into it. Each player that is profiled in this, there's a lot of information on each one, but you are getting into the details with Shawn's synopsis on each one. You get Curtis's top 5 profile sims. You also get the profile sims hit rate, something I think that people are going to be very interested in. And then you get Blair with the prospect lab scores. There's a lot of different information in the profiles. But Shawn, I think best place to start off is to let you do the overview and maybe get in a little bit to the process and the rookie summit, as well as to what you and the guys talk about, discuss, to give what I think is the best guide in the entire industry here for the draft coming up.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And obviously, we're trying to do a good job. We're biased and we like the guide. And I do have to say that I really like the guide this year. It's coming out a little bit later. Part of that was, trying to determine exactly how we wanted to do it. But the final product is looking really cool. I have to give Curtis a lot of credit for how he's put this together. I do think that when you're talking about rookie, you want the stuff to look cool too, right? And so I love what he's done with that. But the thing that I always want to be aware of when we're talking about prospects and when we're evaluating prospects is that there's so much that we don't know. And we want to be very humble in terms of, as you go through the process, not feeling like there's one secret key that unlocks everything for you. Now, one of the articles that I really enjoyed and, wrote about and put the skeleton key title on, many, many years ago, sort of at the beginning of RotoViz, talked about breakout age and that early production. We know that that obviously makes a huge, huge difference. It's something that we still focus on very heavily. And yet there are so many different ways that we can look at the data. And I think that painting the full and rounded picture is important. So I wrote the blurbs for this guide. If you run into anything troubling there, I'm the person that you have to blame. One of the things that I want to say about this process is it's just so much fun for me. And we bring in, with the kind of four of us who are working on it initially, we bring in different perspectives where Curtis and Dave are, much more interested in college football and have kind of that background to where they're familiar with a lot of these guys. Now, I play a lot of Devy, and so I'm familiar with the players as guys coming into college, and then from a big picture perspective, understanding who the stars are as they move through, as I work through these Devy rosters. But I'm not a college football guy. I don't believe Blair's a college football guy. Blair and I are really looking at the numbers and familiarizing ourselves for the first time in a deeper way, right? In a less superficial way as we kind of go through this process. And I think that there's some value to that in that you don't bring in all of these biases of believing that it's just a sure thing, that this guy's a hit, this guy's a miss, this is where they were, this is who they are. It's helpful for me, at least, to have fresh eyes and not to feel like I know everything when I come into it. I think it keeps me more open-minded and more interested in the information as I work through it. So that part for me was fun. And as you mentioned, we've got 90 plus players that we've profiled. Obviously, we go a lot deeper into the guys who are going to be first round picks, second round picks. Then we do the players who are expected to be undrafted free agents. But we do have some info on them as well. So I'm taking these guys, I'm looking at the RotoViz tools, I'm looking at the RotoViz signature metrics, but I'm also bringing in a ton of data from Sports Info Solutions, which, Colm, people have loved over the last several years, where that's the data that powers the advanced stat explorer, the advanced team stat explorer, the stealing signals tool, the wide receiver cornerback matchups tool that was the backbone for the piece that Dave wrote that was so wildly popular in season. It was the backbone for the piece that Blair wrote, the matchups article, kind of big picture that was so popular in season. So I have all of that information and to work through it. And then what I did with these blurbs was to try and create a compelling picture of who that player was, from how they came into college as a recruit, where they fit as they move through, some of the competition that they faced, because none of these stats are generated outside of context. If you have an elite quarterback versus a quarterback who is not even a viable college quarterback, that's going to make a difference in some of your volume stats, obviously. If you're playing with 3 future other first-round draft picks, that is going to make a difference versus if you're the one guy out there by himself getting all of the volume. So we work through some of those types of things, and then we talk about a lot of the peripherals that are interesting and try and bring out little pieces that might help you understand a player better, the most fun nuggets, this metric, that metric, where the guy really separates himself, or what's the most relevant part of his profile. And so, obviously you're trying to do it in a way that you would like to read it yourself. I think that these blurbs are pretty dense, which is helpful, so you don't have to read a bunch of unnecessary stuff and you can get through the guide. At the same time, what is there is very information heavy. So anyway, that was the goal. Obviously, listeners will be able to tell us whether or not that was achieved or not. But Colm, this was a lot of fun. And then with that, we have the Prospect Lab scores that Blair Andrews put together. And so you have a different angle. And then we have the top sim scores from the box score scout that Curtis has pulled together. I really like, again, this idea of trying to understand the prospect from multiple angles and multiple angles that really give you insight, as opposed to trying to drill down to one thing and say, like, this is what is going to tell me if the guy is good. And so trying to avoid that certainty and pushing some guys way up our board and some guys way down our board and not having that full balance, not having the roundedness. I love what the guide does for you from that perspective in terms of, again, giving you these different pieces. And the other thing is just it's fun, right? When you have the guide score or when you have the lab score, when you have the sims, when you have the advanced stats and all of that in one place, in one page, with the player, it's a very quick way to do research that's also very entertaining and a lot of fun. And Colm, a lot of this is about fun, right? So I think the guide delivers on that. Again, you'll let us know. Colm, I wrote a piece last week talking about the running backs a little bit, talking about broken tackles. I used some of Blair's past research, pulled up these guys from the last 5 years. And one of the things that I wanted to point out to readers, and this is similar to this idea of having a well-rounded understanding of where we are with the individual prospects. But one of the things I wanted to really emphasize is that broken tackles is something that will help you find guys who are going to play, who are going to score fantasy points, who are going to be desired by decision makers. They're going to be people who are targeted in the drafts, but that also creates a huge amount of trap potential. And so some of these guys who became the trendiest players either in fantasy or with reality GMs are also the riskiest ones for you because you have to pay a certain price, right? You can't just pick some guy that you think is a lot of fun and play second or third round prices, draft him in the 18th round of best ball leagues. That's not the way that it works. You got to pay what the market says. And when we look at these big tackle breaking guys from the past 5 years, 4 names really jump out: Najee Harris, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Zach Moss, David Montgomery. And it's not something where I want to point at those guys and look, these are terrible players. Only one of them has been a pure bust at the NFL level. Montgomery and Harris actually having very good years last year. Zach Moss, somebody who did a ton for the Colts and was a big 0 RB guy in the first half of the season before Jonathan Taylor gets back and kind of mixes in there. These guys were able to stick in the league because they have taken that trait of breaking tackles to the NFL, and they still do it. The problem that all 3 of those guys have is that they don't gain yards after they break tackles. And so they got to break a ton of tackles to accomplish much. We want to be aware of the potential trap elements of these guys as well. So we're balancing the idea that, yeah, these guys are going to be drafted. They're going to play. They're probably going to stick. The coach is going to look at someone like Najee Harris and be like, his backup is way better, but look at that dude break tackles. He's like, I like the physicality. I like the macho-ness of it. I think we can establish the run by Najee Harris running into the line, dancing around, breaking a tackle, falling on the ground. Again, that's an exaggeration. I mean, Harris is a pretty good back, and I think in a different offense might be a very good back. But we want to balance these things. Colm, I paused there because I'm looking at their name, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and I can't get over it. I can't get over it. It doesn't matter. The Chiefs win the Super Bowl.
Is he the player that you're saying was the only clear bust? I'm trying to figure out is it?
Colm, don't mess with me. We go into then the piece. And one of the things here that I also find interesting, I mentioned in the article, is that we have the broken tackles and we have the forced missed tackles. And I think the broken tackles tend to be the sexier stat and the one where truly the back controls that. You have the forced missed tackles. There's nothing that's that manly about running up to the defender and then running around him, right? Run over him. Show you're the tougher guy. The forced missed tackles are actually more valuable to you as a fantasy drafter as they allow you to beat draft possession better than broken tackles do. Obviously, the two things in concert can create a star for you. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. We're actually looking at the two pieces separately here so we can just drill down onto this particular stat. Colm, the other element that we want to emphasize here too is that broken tackles are not the end all and be all, and that there is the potential to succeed if you have the right other mix of traits, even if that's a red flag for you. we got a couple of guys who were pretty successful fantasy players in 2023 who had some pretty huge issues with broken tackles, yards after contact, evasion rate. Those names jump out to you at all?
Those names that you're referring to, Shawn, Rachaad White and Isaiah Pacheco, players that we did focus on quite a number of times during the course of the season, both for various reasons. Pacheco for maybe his running style and the success that he was having at the time. But Rachaad White was somebody who, like at college with some of the red flags that may have come in, was very inefficient coming into the opening kind of 4 weeks or so of the season, and that really turned around. And I guess they are both on the other side of the coin as to how sometimes these numbers players can still have success then when they enter the league.
And that's the thing that I really want to emphasize here, and the reason why the different pieces make a difference, because we end up getting a huge amount of focus on the trendy stats as you go through the draft process. And what we still tend to find, and what the NFL GMs are going to emphasize, is that it's the overall production, and it's that running back lab score, even stripped of information like the broken tackle numbers, that's going to give you a sense of where that player really projects. And so when you get numbers like a 100 for Jonathan Taylor, or a 98 for a Breece Hall, or a 99 for a Leonard Fournette, Ezekiel Elliott, those types of players, those guys are going to go in and be huge fantasy weapons. A Saquon Barkley, for example. Again, thinking of names where, these guys, based on what they did in college, you have a 95 plus, a Christian McCaffrey, for example. Huge running back prospect lab scores. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about the details there, because the overall combination of youth, production, and athleticism gives you what you need from the running back position. And so when we have the prospect lab score in there as well, we have the Sims, which again, when you bring up guys like a Jonathan Taylor or a Breece Hall or a Saquon Barkley, that's a pretty good indication that you're going to be a star yourself. Now, Colm, one of the reasons why this class is so interesting and some of these peripherals are going to matter is that we don't have guys like that in this class. And one of the things that was so interesting about doing the Rookie Summit was this sort of debate about whether any running backs would land in the first round of Superflex rookie drafts. And that seems crazy to people. And it's one of the reasons that if you have Bijan Robinson in Dynasty, for example, and you're a little bit disappointed there and you're thinking there's a chance to get out, the offense is going to be better, I'd like to take that piece and sell really high, just from the perspective of it could still go poorly. You can get hurt. You can turn that piece into a lot of different guys. If you can turn Robinson into 3 players who help you, that is a viable tactic. And yet you want to be aware of the fact that coming in this year is nothing. And it's not going to be nothing, but it's going to be a situation where the hits are going to be probably more on the level like a Tyjae Spears, where maybe you have to wait a year and then you're looking into year 2 and you're like, I think it's there, but we still have a lot to prove. That makes the guys who are already on your roster, who are young, dynamic backs, it makes a Breece Hall more valuable. It makes a Bijan Robinson more valuable. It certainly boosts guys like Achane and Gibbs, and even someone who is more middle of the career, has had some injury issues, was plagued by an offense last year. It makes a guy like Travis Etienne more interesting, because we don't get a wave of stars this year. But Colin, what we do have is we have some guys who are really interesting. So we look at the numbers here in the article, and on a per play basis, some of the guys who really pop are going to be like a Marshawn Lloyd, a Jalen Wright. And you're thinking, where is this combination of tackle breaking ability, overall dynamism, and then the trade-off there with the fact that you don't have the overall volume of production that a player with these peripherals really should have. And so that's a big red flag for you. You can go through, you can look at those guys. I obviously like the players who are very dynamic and who have demonstrated that at the collegiate level, especially if they have some athleticism, if they have some receiving upside. That's going to factor into it. But Colm, the guy that I wanted to focus on here to kind of close out this show is Bucky Irving. And he's somebody who has a lot of really interesting stuff in the guide. We talk about him averaging over 100 yards from scrimmage in both of his years at Oregon. He has this 1,593-yard, 13-touchdown season as a junior. But the part that goes with that, when you're talking about a smaller player and you're talking about a player in an offense where the offense probably set them up to do a lot, and something that's just kind of vaguely interesting to me about where we are in this draft process so far. And again, as I said at the beginning, coming in with somewhat fresh eyes and from a non-CFB analyst perspective. But you have these 4 teams who were in the college football playoff. And then I think you could argue even Florida State, who a lot of controversy there in terms of them missing that playoff. Those 5 teams have a lot of prospects who are up in the draft. And when you look at their backgrounds, it feels like their prospect status is being inflated by the team's success. Now, the flip side of that is that in many cases, it's harder to generate all of the numbers if your team is so dominant that your teammates are cannibalizing some of the things you possibly would have been able to do for somebody else. So anyway, it's just something that you kind of note there. But then you contrast that with Oregon, who might have been the best team in the country. Now, certainly our great friend Ben Gretsch is going to push back on that because his Washington Huskies defeated them twice in huge moments. The Oregon guys seem undervalued by contrast to what they actually did and what they put up numbers-wise and the enthusiasm surrounding them. And we look at Irving, and he's a smaller back, but the peripherals here are pretty crazy, right? He had more broken tackles with 34 than forced missed tackles, 29 in his final year. He had an evasion rate above 30%, which is up there in the elite range. Anything over 30, you're talking about an uber prospect, at least from the perspective, again, of breaking tackles. You need to have the volume to go with it. One of the things that's interesting about Irving is that he did. The only back in college football to go over 25 broken and 25 forced missed in each of the 22 and 23 seasons. And then he also caught 87 passes in his final 2 years, 56 in his final season alone, and added 21 additional evaded tackles as a receiver. Right. So when I see those numbers, I'm like, I'm going to draft that dude in best ball until the cows come home, basically every single draft until his price goes up. One of the things we may find is maybe his price goes down. And I'm not going to completely give this away, but again, one of the reasons that we have these other pieces in the guide is that when you look at the Prospect Lab score and you look at the sims for Irving, you do get a sense of why he's somewhat down the list, right? There are some red flags that pop up in these 2 other parts of the evaluation. Check out the guide to see what those are. It is very interesting. And one of the things I want to say too to subscribers, we're going to have a ton of content on the site. These 2 pieces, the guide and the site subscription, are going to be very complimentary as we go through this. We're going to have a ton of information out there. I'll have the forced missed tackles article out in the near future. We've got some new writers. Kevin's doing a fantastic job with his pieces. He's been a long time OT listener. Obviously, Matt has continued to crank out, so much good work. Blair and I are going to have stuff out. Curtis is going to have a lot of articles looking at how you can exploit these different types of things. We know what Curtis's track record is and background is in Dynasty. I don't know if it comes through, Colm, but I'm pretty fired up for prospect season.
Yeah, Shawn, we can get it in the enthusiasm as Shawn talks through just one prospect on today's show, but talking through his article as well, which I will link in today's show notes. And in that, lots of information around the different metrics that he is using, broken tackles, as he mentioned, stuff percentage, and much, much more involved in there. But the Prospect Lab, Shawn mentioned at the start, been doing this for a number of years, 7th anniversary edition of the guide. So I think, Shawn, we can say the best one yet. It keeps getting better every single year. So 98 player profiles, all the information we were talking about today, the player sims, the prospect scores, and Shawn's individual thoughts on the players. Check it out. There will be 3 editions, as I mentioned, at the top of today's show, and you can get all of them for a total of $19.99. So well worth it. Link in today's show notes to check it out. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at OverToMartin. My co-host, as always, Shawn Siegele. check out Shawn's work on rotoviz.com and also in the RotoViz Rookie Guide. But until we are back, have a good one.